I did it! I finally finished Dark Souls 3. To give a recap, my time with FromSoft games actually started with Bloodborne. When I realized that I could get through the whole thing as long as I didn't give up, it led me to their other games, starting with Dark Souls 1. I ended up loving my experience with those games so much that it led to me playing through Elden Ring, Dark Souls 2, and finally Dark Souls 3. It's been a long journey, but I'm glad that I finally got through the series. At this point, I feel like the Soulsborne ring formula has become so familiar to me that it made the game easier in some ways. I think I mentioned in my Dark Souls 2 video that I wouldn't go into detail with things like bonfires, Estus flasks, and enemies respawning, which I still won't talk too much about here. I'll focus more on my experience with the game. I'm hoping that newcomers can come along and still enjoy everything though. I'll also be comparing some things in this game to Dark Souls 1 and 2, so yeah, let's get on with the video. Dark Souls 3 begins with a bleak cutscene that's beautifully animated. The narration in this game kind of felt like it went back to Dark Souls 1's roots, and by that, I mean I had to rewatch the whole thing over and over and read about the story to understand what it was about. So the cutscene begins with the narrator saying that the game's set in the kingdom of Lothric. A bell has rung, signaling that the Age of Fire is ending. In order to prolong this age, you have to link the fire by killing the Lords of Cinder and placing their ashes on their thrones. Oh, and you play as an Unkindled, which I think is the remains of someone who failed to link the flame previously, so they're undead? Anyway, after the cutscene ends, you'll need to create your character. You can choose lots of stuff like their class and starting item, but customizing their appearance can get just as complex as the older games. Though I'd say that it's much easier to create an attractive character in Dark Souls 3. It only took like 2 Souls games, but they finally did it! Just like the previous games, there's a ton of sliders, hairstyles, and color options for everything, so you can make your character as ugly or beautiful as you want. After that, you'll wake up at a graveyard and start playing through the game. The first thing I noticed when I gained control of my character was how much faster the game was compared to 2, and especially 1. Sprinting, rolling, and swinging my sword around felt swift, so I had to get used to that. It really helped that the starting area was a tutorial section too, so I took my time to learn the mechanics, especially since it's been like a year or something since I played Dark Souls 2. And of course, looking for ways to cheese was part of it. Reaching Firelink Shrine for the first time, the game's hub world was really nice though. It felt different from Dark Souls 1 and 2, but it still had a similar calming atmosphere, though I'd say that it's a bit more solemn. Like, there are NPCs that sell things and stick around depending on what you say and do, but the place felt more like a stopover for most characters, so every time someone new would appear, I'd start wondering if they would still be there the next time I came back. I thought that the design of Dark Souls 3's Firelink Shrine felt a little closer to Demon's Souls hub world, though it's much smaller. But since I have a horrible sense of direction, I got lost because of all the stairs and little passageways. It didn't help that NPCs were scattered around the area, so whenever I was looking for someone specific, I'd find a completely different person. I got used to it eventually. Just like the previous games, finding every NPC and following their storyline is next to impossible without a guide. There's just too many ways to fail them if you don't follow specific steps, from exhausting their dialogue to missing out on one meeting spot. I ended up failing quite a few of them because I started my playthrough before my 1-month vacation earlier this year, and then I continued it as soon as I got the chance to play the game again. I'm just happy that I managed to continue quest lines of my favorite NPCs, like the Onion Knight. He was just so wholesome that I was always smiling every time I met him in the game. Now, Dark Souls 3's world is huge, and it has a bunch of locations that feel very familiar. There are castles, forest areas, and villages that are similar to previous entries. I also like how the game felt a bit nostalgic at times, with callbacks to certain locations and NPCs from Dark Souls 1. And of course, Poison Swamps. Oh god, I'm getting so many flashbacks from my time in Farron's Keep. The whole place was just poison. I gave up trying to heal myself and embraced it all. I would just sprint and roll around while 10 different enemies were chasing after me. But anyway, my point is, a lot of things were familiar, so there wasn't much that really made me go, wow. Except for the vistas. Dark Souls 3 continues to have incredible looking vistas that made me stop and stare in awe. Just like the previous games, I was just happy to explore and see all the usual features in Souls games, like the messages players leave behind, their phantoms and bloodstains. Even though it was my first time playing Dark Souls 3, seeing these features made me feel kind of at home, even when people leave the same cringy messages that I've seen in the past games. As much as I liked the interconnected world of Dark Souls 1, a part of me was really happy that fast travel was a normal thing in Dark Souls 3. Sure, the game's more linear than the previous games, but I just love the convenience of teleporting everywhere using any bonfire, and that includes returning to Firelink Shrine. It was great being able to explore, go back to the hub world and level up or buy a few things, then jump straight back to the last bonfire I was in. Now, playing through different Souls games made me feel like I was prepared for everything that Dark Souls 3 had to throw at me, but I was so wrong. I still died hundreds of times, though I've definitely gotten better with parrying and backstabbing enemies, but kicking was still beyond me. I'd end up just accidentally doing it when I'm trying to lunge forward and swing my sword. Just like the previous games, there are tons of different weapons and magic to use. Melee weapons alone range from swords, spears, axes, and many more. My personal playstyle involved using a one-handed sword and a shield early in the game, but eventually I switched to a two-handed sword for my strength build. Yeah, I thought of using magic, but I just can't let go of my swords. I have to have my massive berserk-style weapons. There's one thing that I missed about Dark Souls 2 though, and it's the drip. I think that the previous game had armor that looked way cooler than the ones in Dark Souls 3, so I didn't find a lot of them that interesting to look at, with the exception of certain armor sets. Still, I love the look of the classic ones like the Elite Knight set. It just looked so cool. But yeah, I rarely swapped armor in this game since I didn't think that it made too much of a difference. I ended up just swapping through different rings, mostly to the ones that increased things like my stamina recovery speed or elemental resistance, which was really helpful for certain enemies and bosses. I mentioned in my Dark Souls 2 review that the enemies were faster and way more aggressive than in the first game, but Dark Souls 3 takes it even higher, minus the weird enemy placements, in most places at least. It almost felt like the combat and enemies in this game served as a blueprint for Elden Ring. Some of them were relentless. I like that there was a ton of enemy variety though. I thought that the bosses in Dark Souls 3 were also varied and challenging to fight against. Some of them were a little too similar to bosses from previous games, but with the added speed and aggression of Dark Souls 3's combat, I struggled with the bosses that punished me whenever I tried to heal out of desperation. It didn't help that some of them had delayed attacks too. It gave me a lot of Elden Ring flashbacks. And of course, I summoned some NPCs and other players when I felt like I needed it, but not as much as before since I either missed their summon signs or I was just too busy running away from enemies chasing me. I actually had trouble with the game's online features early on. Nobody was summoning me, and I even had trouble finding people to invade. There would always be an error after minutes of waiting around. At first I thought it was something to do with the game, but nope, it was my old router. Yeah, I ended up upgrading my router to a new one in the middle of my playthrough, and it suddenly improved all my random internet-related issues, including Dark Souls 3. By the time it was all fixed, I got used to running into boss fights by myself. It was a peaceful life, at least until someone would invade my game and try to sabotage my playthrough. I don't know if it was just the ping or if they were cheating, but sometimes I'd be doing my best to fight back and their HP just wouldn't go down. I ended up being in the Way of Blue Covenant for most of the game just because I appreciated that it summoned other players to help me out while fighting invaders. So yeah, covenants are also a thing in Dark Souls 3, and they're basically factions that let you get items, abilities, and PvP mechanics. I didn't interact with this part of the game much, but I do like that you can easily change covenants as long as you've already discovered them. It's been a while since I played through Dark Souls 1 and 2, but I'm pretty sure that depending on the version you played, you had to find and talk to the leaders of each covenant every time you wanted to change your faction. It's a huge quality of life improvement for Dark Souls 3 to just let you change factions by equipping the items that they give you in your inventory. Now, before I end the video, I'll be talking about the DLCs, so feel free to skip to the final thoughts section if you don't want some mild spoilers. The first DLC I played was Ashes of Ariandel. I accidentally started it early in my playthrough actually. I wouldn't be surprised if other people made the same mistake, since the NPC for the DLC was literally next to a bonfire in the main game. But yeah, the DLC has this guy in a chapel asking you for a favor. He tells you that his lady lives in the land of Ariandel, and that he wants you to show her flame in order to burn the rot away. Yeah, I don't know what it all means, but if you accept, you get transported to the DLC area. The whole place is a snowy environment that reminds me of an optional location in Dark Souls 1, so I thought that was pretty cool. But anyway, the DLC has a few new NPCs, enemies, and bosses. It also has more items, weapons, and armor to collect. Other than that, I thought that Ashes of Ariandel was okay. I mean, it was fun to play through, but it wasn't exactly the best Dark Souls DLC I've ever played. I think it lacked content, and it was really short. The new map wasn't too interesting to explore too, and I'd say that it even got annoying at times. Navigating through the mountain pass in particular was just frustrating, especially with all the enemies scattered around. It almost felt like, because the DLC was so short, FromSoft purposely placed a bunch of enemies around just to slow down your progress. I don't know exactly how long it took me to beat the whole thing, but the Ashes of Ariandel DLC seems to be about 4 hours in length. I'd say that the only memorable thing about it was the final boss, just because they were a super challenging fight that made me wonder if it was worth completing the whole thing. Turns out it was absolutely worth it in the end, because the next DLC was so much better. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the Ringed City DLC now. You can start this one right after you finish Ashes of Ariandel, and oh man, as soon as I got teleported to the new map, I knew that this was going to be a huge step up. Like, Dreg Keep was such a gorgeous looking place, even though it was literally ruins and ashes. It just felt like a sight to behold because of the scale of each building. Unfortunately, I didn't get the chance to admire the view after venturing off because of all the enemies and beams trying to kill me. It was really fun just running for my life and jumping down all of the high platforms, even though they were more like a gimmick for the beginning area of the game. But yeah, not only is this DLC better, it has even more content. There's multiple bosses, enemies, and tons of different weapons, armor, and items to collect. I don't think I've found every single item because of how huge the locations were. I wouldn't be surprised if I missed out on a few secrets too. But I did my best to explore, since the actual path is linear. It's just that the game made its areas so much more interesting to explore by giving you different shortcuts and little pathways that led to smaller areas. Oh, and I love the boss fights in this DLC. Some of them felt like a combination of previous bosses merged into one, but it was fun and challenging to play against them. But again, just like Ashes of Ariandel, I don't know how long it took me to go through this DLC. The standard time seems to be over 8 hours though. By the time I finished everything, it felt strangely bittersweet. Maybe because this was the end of Dark Souls, or at least it was kind of like a second ending for me, since I beat the main game before all this. Overall, Dark Souls 3 was such a good game. It took me around 44 hours to beat it, along with its DLCs. I still got that bittersweet feeling watching the credits roll, and realizing that I finally did it. I went through all 3 games and finally beat the last entry. I remember struggling and giving up over and over while playing the first game over a decade ago, which for me practically mirrored how I dealt with a lot of things in my life. Playing these games taught me that perseverance is what it takes to get through all kinds of difficult situations, and if it still doesn't work out, taking a step back or even changing your strategy works wonders. I still have a soft spot for Dark Souls 1 and 2, but the trilogy has become one of my favorite series in gaming, and I won't ever stop playing FromSoft titles. In fact, I finished Sekiro recently. Let me know what you thought about the video. Oh, and like and subscribe if you liked my content. And thank you to my patrons at Patreon for supporting my channel. Phew. Writing lengthy scripts usually take a lot of time and effort for me, but I managed to finish this one way faster than my older ones. I'd say that's an improvement in my productivity, and I really hope that it continues. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.